This video is going to demonstrate how to install a DHCP server on Linux. The video assumes that you already have a correctly configured static IP address. If you don't know how to do that, please refer to the relevant lab. It also assumes that you've installed the DHCP3 server package. Again, if you don't know how to do that, please refer to the relevant lab to do so. Once that's all been installed and configured, if you then log on as a user who is able to elevate themselves to root privileges so that they have permission to modify system files, then you'll be able to complete the lab that we're going through at the moment. So, first thing we need to do, we're logged on as a suitable user. I'm going to open up a terminal window, and the first thing I'm going to do is use sudo to elevate my privileges to the root user, and I'm going to open a text editor gedit. I'm going to put in my password to prove I am indeed who I claim to be, and the text editor is now open with a blank file displayed. I now need to open the first configuration file for the DHCP server, and this is in the /etc/default/DHCP3-server. I now need to open the first configuration file for the server. I'll find that in the /etc directory, in the /default subdirectory, and the file is called DHCP3-server. So to find that, click on Open, File System, etc. Remember, the etc folder contains all of the configuration files for the system. Scroll down to Default, open that folder, and then I'm looking for DHCP3 server, and I open that up. Now, because I'm running as the root user, notice I don't have a read-only message displayed at the top, so I can edit and save this file. And this file here is for configuring which interfaces the DHCP server will listen on, so basically which interfaces any incoming DHCP requests will be picked up by the server and acted upon. This particular virtual machine we're using only has one network interface. However, in a real server environment, it's quite possible that a server will have multiple network interfaces, and therefore for security and performance reasons we just want to specify the ones that we want to listen for DHCP messages through. How do I know the name of the interface? Notice it gives examples of ETH0, ETH1. Well, there's several ways I can do that. First of all, I can go into the networking menu, and it says in here auto ETH1. That's the first way. The second way is I can go back to my terminal window. Now I need to open a new terminal, because at the moment this current shell is running the gedit program. I can do that by going to File and Open Tab, or alternatively the Control-Shift-T shortcut opens up a new tab. And if I use the ifconfig command, this will display the configuration information for the network interfaces, and notice that we have two of them here. ETH1 is a wired network interface, an Ethernet interface, and LO is the loopback, a virtual network interface. So the one that we need to use here is ETH1. So I'm just going to minimize that, go back to here and put ETH1 as the interface we want to listen on, and save that file. So the next file that we need to edit is a configuration file for setting up the scopes on the DHCP server. So again, open the file browser, into File System, etc. And this time I'm looking for a DHCP3 directory. And in there we have dhcpdconf, and this is the configuration file for the server. Opening that up, we find that the file already contains a great deal of information already, but most of this is preceded by a little hash sign, and the hash sign is a comment, and a comment indicates that that particular line should be ignored by the computer. It's there for human purposes only, for explaining in most cases what each of the sections of the file does, and in some cases it's for literally just giving examples here. So here's an example of a very, very basic subnet of what this can look like, so that you can just uncomment it out and use that as a template. So we're going to do that now. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the options common to all supported networks. These are what we'll call the server options. So all of the subnets or scopes we define on this server will use these as their default settings. For this example here, I'm going to change the domain name to be boston-t-party.com. So that's going to be our domain name for all subnets on this server. I'm going to comment out the name servers line here because I want to set that up as a scope or subnet option later down, but I'm going to leave the default and max lease times exactly as they are at this particular time. So that's the server level options configured. I'm now going to scroll down a little bit further. Notice we have here, as they describe it, a very basic subnet configuration. So we've got the subnet definition itself, so that's the network address, the subnet mask, and then the range of IP addresses that it's going to give out, the scope as we would call that, so the pool as we might call that. We've also got an option for the routers here, so this would be a default gateway for this particular option. Now we're scrolling down a bit further until we find this one here, which is a bit more comprehensive. And I'm going to uncomment the first line and update that. We're going to use a 10.1.1.0 network and 255.255.255.0 for our subnet mask. Now you might ask, where did I get that information from? Well, again, if this was a real network, I as the network administrator or IT manager or whoever would have defined that myself. I would have said this is what our networking scheme is. So once I've put that in there, I'm going to uncomment the range option and modify that appropriately, 10.1.1.10 to 10.1.1.30. Again, where would I get that information from? Well, basically I'm just making it up in this instance, but again you would define your range to be a suitable number of addresses for the size of your network. So here we have 21 available addresses, 10 all the way up to 30. Clearly I would define that range to be suitable for the size and scale of the network that I was implementing the server for. The domain name servers option is the next one, which I'm going to uncomment, and I'm going to update that here to be dns.boston-t-party.com. The other thing I could do here, rather than putting in a name, is I can actually just specify that as an IP address. So I could put in 10.1.1.1, which happens to be this particular computer. I'm going to leave the domain name option commented out. Okay, the simple reason for that is that we defined it in the server options above, so there's no point defining it again here with the same value. If I now comment out, I'll remove the comment, sorry, from the option routers. Remember that routers is the default gateway, so how we get out of this subnet onto another subnet, possibly the internet or similar. I'm going to define that as 10.1.1.2. Again, that's something you would know in advance, would be defined by your network administrator, so you would put the correct address in there. The broadcast address, again I'm going to modify that, and I'm going to put that in as 10.1.1.255. Well, how do I know it's that? Well, if we were to look at our networking basics, we would find, of course, that anything on the 10.1.1.0 subnet, okay, is going to have a 10.1.1.255 broadcast address, simply because we define a broadcast address as the taking your IP address, finding the host portion, and filling that all with ones in binary. That's going to give us the broadcast address for that subnet. I'm going to leave commented out the default lease time and the max lease time, because we've already got those configured further up as server options. But I must remember now to uncomment this final bracket here, otherwise we're going to end up with error messages. So if I now save that, the file has been saved, I can now go back to my terminal window. Now, hopefully what's going to happen now is when I start the server it will work, so let's just have a look at that. And I now need to use sudo again, because this is a administrator level option. I'm reconfiguring the server. I'm saying which services are starting and stopping, so I need to be the root user to do that. The path to the script that starts and stops the server is in /etc, because that's where we find all the configuration files, /init.d, which is where we find all of the scripts for starting and stopping system services, and it's called DHCP3-server. Now there are a number of options that this script takes. One of the most common ones is status, which tells us whether it's running or not, so let's just try that one at the moment. I need to put my password in again to identify myself, and it says that it's not running. Now that's not going to be a surprise to us because we haven't actually started it yet. So let's start that up now. So I'm going to give it the start option, starting the server, and the server has now started happily. So the server's now running. It's listening on the ETH1 interface and should now be issuing clients with IP addresses from this particular pool of addresses here. Now, if when we ran that script we came up with a fail message, an error, how could we go about troubleshooting that? Well, the first thing that we could go about looking at is if we go into System and Administration and Log File Viewer, and if we were to maximize this, this is where we can view from the desktop all of the log files that are created on the system. And syslog is a system-wide logging facility, and the DHCP3 server writes messages to this log. So if we open it up and notice that the first things in this log, if I just make this a little bit narrower so it's easier to see, are all relating to the startup of the computer. So if we scroll down right to the bottom, you'll notice here, DHCPD, all of these messages here have come from the DHCP server. And it's basically saying that everything is going fairly swimmingly. There are no error messages in here, and it's basically said at the moment it's wrote 0 leases to the leases file. So at the moment it hasn't received any updates on its defined network interface, so it hasn't written anything to the lease file, it hasn't given out any IP addresses at the moment. But what we can do now is we can then switch over to a client and we can test that. However, that will be the subject of a different video.